Do I, who've read Freud and know what the future of an illusion really is and know that religious belief is ineradicable as long as we remain a stupid, poorly evolved mammalian species, think that some Canadian law is going to solve this problem? Please. No, our problem is this: our prefrontal lobes are too small, and our adrenaline glands are too big, and our thumb finger opposition isn't all that it might be. And we're afraid of the dark, and we're afraid to die, and we believe in the truths of holy books that are so stupid and so fabricated that a child can, and all children do, but as you can tell by their questions, actually see through them.
That was the late, great Christopher Hitchens. And what he had to say is, of course, quite relevant to recent events and to what I have to say in this video. Now, the reason I'm making this video is, in fact, related to the events of 13/11, that the Paris attack of the previous weekend, or just prior to the weekend. But I'm going to be going into greater detail the psychology of religious motivation and things I've already actually talked about to some degree. Now, many of you have watched or listened to The Contented Irrationalist, and many of the things I talked about in that video, mortality, salience, things of that nature, very, very relevant to the issues at hand. But for those of you who haven't watched that or are not inclined or unfamiliar, I will be posting a link in the low bar. In a nutshell, our desire from an evolutionary perspective to preserve our ego, our sort of emotional wholesomeness, if you will, that desire tends to supersede logic, facts, and truth when faced with such things, which is to say, hence the reason for the title, The Contented Irrationalist, most people are perfectly content and pleased to disregard and balk at reality if that balking at reality leads them to a happier, more content state of mind. Not everyone, but I think most people have a natural inclination, and this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We evolved to value ourselves and value our thoughts, and we need to do this from an evolutionary perspective, because if we don't do this, we might not be motivated to keep on fighting the good fight for survival and then, of course, reproduction in order to pass on our genes. Ultimately, this is where it goes back to, and that strange quirk of fate, although Hitchens does say our prefrontal lobes are too small. I mean, we lucked out in the evolutionary gamble, and we have rather large, or a rather large neocortex. This affords us the unique possibility to be aware of our mortality, hence the term mortality salience, something that was coined, incidentally, by Ernst Becker in his Denial of Death, which I reference, of course, in that video as well. Highly recommend the book. And I'll be talking more about the things he talks about in that book and the recent events and Islamism as an idea. But Christopher Hitchens, and that's the reason why I have it as an introduction, is really spot on. We are afraid to die. We're afraid of the dark. And afraid of the dark is kind of a euphemism, isn't it? We're afraid of unpleasant truths. Many of us spend much of our lives scurrying about the world, avoiding every unpleasant truth possible. And it's not just religious. It's everything. You see, what I like to refer to as the obfuscation industry has multiple branches, seemingly, but ultimately these branches of the obfuscation industry belong to one. All of these people, be they engaged in religiously obfuscatory activities or those of science, for example, people who declare neurosexism, the unreality of sexually dimorphic human species and different brains, different neurological structures, and so on and so forth. This is actually very much the same thing. All of these people are engaged in an effort to obscure and to obfuscate unpleasant realities. They are seeking to balk at reality. And this is the key problem, not of our time, but of our species. The name of the video, of course, is, the elephant in the room. And a lot of people would say Islam is the elephant in the room. No, Islam is a small elephant. It is a part of the elephant. Maybe it's a baby elephant, but there's a bigger issue at hand. And as I said, most of what I talked about now is referenced in the Contented Irrationalist, but it's very relevant to bring this up again. When we are confronted with things that don't make us feel good, but the weight of the evidence is incredibly strong, many of us falter, founder, and fail, and we retain our false beliefs because they make us feel better about ourselves. Put quite simply, we are just animals, as Christopher Hitchens eloquently put it. We lucked out in the evolutionary lottery. We have some assets that other animals don't have. But if there is any recurrent message on my channel and in my videos, in the body of my work, it is that we are just animals, and we need to come to terms with that and beware of our animalistic behavior. And mortality salience fits into that because we need, as a species, generally speaking, to push back unpleasant truths in order to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. This is true of just about everything, be it the sexually dimorphic nature of our species, Islam, whatever, any religion. This is also true of the manosphere. I and others spend a lot of time talking about the differences between men and women and breaking down the building blocks of what goes into the mating ritual, for example. And I want to mention something here, and I don't want to name names because I'm not trying to be inflammatory, but I read an article, if you wish to term it that, an essay, a piece of writing by someone reasonably well known in the manosphere, who, and I'm paraphrasing here, like I said, I don't want to name names, essentially said, quite literally, actually this is literal, if he believed what most MGTOW believed, he would kill himself because he couldn't live with himself having brought his son into the world. Now, of course, this is buttressed and riposted by, but fortunately what MGTOW believe isn't true. And he goes on to describe essentially what I refer to as the mythical love bond between men and women and blah, 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 blah. Now, you could have easily substituted his language of mythical pair bonds and mystical pair bonds, and essentially we're special, right, with the language of a religious zealot or a religiously persuaded Christian. Said, because imagine a Christian saying something similar. If I believed in the godless world of the atheists, I would literally kill myself because yada, yada, yada. Fortunately, atheists are incorrect. Now, what's interesting about this was that the guy adduced no actual evidence. He provided no references throughout the article or the piece, the writing piece. He just makes assertions. And at the end of it, he, and I'm paraphrasing, says he's not going to list any references because this is for adults. So the adult thing to do is to say, no, I'm not going to give you any references. Everything I'm saying is true nonetheless. I just wanted to mention this because it stems from the same pit of darkness that we all share. Something that Christopher Hitchens talk about. It stems from the Contented Irrationalist. This man openly claims that if he believed that the world isn't as pretty as he believes it to be, he would kill himself because he couldn't live with that. And so rather than living, and once again, he provides no actual evidence, he just makes arguments and assertions without sources or links. Without believing this, he would have no reason to live. It's identical to a religious zealot who claims to find salvation in Christ, or for that matter, the glories of paradise in some sort of Islamic eschatology. So we're beginning to see a relationship between all of these things because they all stem from that pit of darkness, that pit of mortality salience, that pit of coming to terms with unpleasant truths. you see, it's all related. And the obscurantists, the people who obscure these things, the people who wish to obfuscate, they're all engaged in the same business. They might think they have different motivations. For example, the Christian or the Muslim obscurantist might in fact think his mission statement is different from the guy who believes in some sort of mystical love-based pair bond between humans that defies time and the difficulties of reality. But ultimately, it all comes back to that. People wanting to live in a reality that is suited to their desires rather than living in the reality as it is. Now I'm going to play another clip here of the late, great Bertrand Russell, possibly, certainly one of the great thinkers of both the 20th and the 19th century. He was incredibly long-lived. He lived, I believe, to 92. He was born in the late, mid-ish, late-ish 19th century and lived well into the 70s. And let's have a listen to what he has to say. And I want to offer some commentary, because as great a thinker as he was, he missed out on something. So let's have a listen.
Why are you not a Christian?
Because I see no evidence whatever for any of the Christian dogmas. I've examined all the stock arguments in favor of the existence of God, and none of them seem to me to be logically valid.
Do you think there's a practical reason for having a religious belief for many people?
Well, there can't be a practical reason for believing what isn't true. That's quite, at least I rule it out as impossible. Either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you shouldn't. And if you can't find out whether it's true or whether it isn't, you should suspend judgment. But you can't, it seems to me, a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true.
Now there we get to listen to the old school RP, or received pronunciation, the way it used to be done back in the day, very different from today, so that's a pleasure in of itself. But of course we get to hear his views, Bertrand Russell's views, on the difference between utility in belief and accuracy of belief. And frankly speaking, his own consternation, confoundment, and just confusion as to why people would do this. You know, if it's true, you believe it. If it's not, don't. The utility of it simply doesn't come into play. And this man was a fantastically great logician, mathematician, philosopher, along with Albert Whitehead, if I'm recalling totally off the top of my head. He wrote, or he might have written singularly, the history of Western philosophy. I think he did it on his own. Incredible, incredible mind. But he missed something in what he's talking about here. And that's not his own fault. Most people of Russell's mindset, and I'm certainly nowhere near his intellectual equal in terms of intelligence, but I do believe I have the same convictions that you either believe it's in something because it's true or not. Most of us who are in that camp, and we are a minority of people, are disinclined to accept the motivations of other people, the majority of people, who ultimately will be motivated by a utilitarian aspect of their beliefs rather than the veracity of their beliefs. It's a conflict of interest, and he doesn't get it in this clip. He simply doesn't get it. This was originally what motivated me to pen and compose The Contented Irrationalist, and it's still what motivates me now. Like I said, if you want to get an overview or some, a couple of phrases, sentences of my body of work on YouTube, the recurrent message is that we are animals, we evolved in a certain environment that is incompatible in many ways with our current environment, and unless we take these things into account and realize how we operate physiologically, neurologically, psychologically, we are dooming ourselves. And so ultimately, if we want to leap ahead, we will need to push aside our egos. And that's not easy. Most people can't do it. Now, despite what people claim, I am the kind of person who will change his mind if enough evidence is presented. This person who made these assertions about human beings didn't present any evidence. There were no links, no sources. I can't change my mind if he's unwilling to do that. However, I am willing to do that. Now, when you're constantly dealing with reality as it is, yes, you're in for a whole lot of disappointment. It's disappointing to, for example, not have good sports/athletic genetics. It's disappointing to be weak and to not have the capacity, if you're interested, say, in working out, of being exceptionally strong or muscular. It's disappointing, but those are the cards I've been dealt with, and other people have been dealt other shitty cards. I could balk at that reality, right? And a lot of people try, right? Depending on the context. Some people do it religiously. There are people, for example, who work out with shitty genetics and they're thinking they can get around it by using anabolic steroids. Well, that's not going to work because that's not going to change your bone structure. It's not going to change the number of white muscle fibers, fast twitch muscle fibers you have. That's not going to change even your receptivity towards steroids, because there's a genetic factor there too. Some people grow like weeds on steroids, other people don't at all. So you can't really escape reality, but you can spend most of your life, if not your entire life, running around in circles attempting to do so. And if you do so long enough, it seems like you're escaping reality. So the crux of, and I wanted to offer this as a preface to the rest of the video, the crux of the issue here is our inability to accept reality on its own terms because it conflicts with our ego and our desire for feeling good about ourselves. Reality is simply there. It's not there to make you feel good about yourself. But if you want to twist it to your own ends, if you think you can do it and you'll never actually succeed, yeah, you can feel good about yourselves. You can cling to your political ideology, no matter the evidence to the contrary. You can cling to your religious beliefs, whatever the evidence to the contrary. You can cling to beliefs about a mystical, mythical love pair bond between men and women, even though the evidence out there to support that is rather atrocious when you look at the bigger picture. It doesn't matter. You can just cling to these things because it makes you feel good. Because let's face it, some of these people would kill themselves living in reality as it actually is. And so the ego is the focus here. The ego, the conflict between ego, truth, and reality is the elephant in the room. And now we move on to this smaller elephant, if you will, Islam. There, of course, was an attack in Paris. Well over, I think, 130 people died. Several hundred others were injured. ISIS has claimed responsibility. Now, I don't want to focus on the numbers and the details here so much as what is the root of this. Now, I was just talking quite a bit about ego and inspiration. Unfortunately, before I proceed to the ultimate motivation here, we need to talk about the faction of obscurantists called the Muslim or Islamic obscurantists. These are people who, for whatever reason, and it's not really for whatever reason, we know why, do not want to address certain aspects of the religion. So we're going to listen to another clip of a well-known British Muslim woman. She's constantly invited on the BBC, offering her exposition on the motivations behind this kind of jihadism, Islamism. So we'll have a listen to this, and then I'm going to offer some commentary as well as a counter made by an actual Muslim.
I think IS, first of all, I don't think we should do it the favour of calling it an Islamic state. I think that plays into very much the image that
they
like
call
to
themselves Islamic State,
exactly.
but they don't have one yet.
No, and I would say that, I'll refer to them as IS, but I mean, IS is a product of a political reality, not an ancient religion, and it's quite clear that when you look at the profile And many of the young men who head out there, they are what one report refers to as religious novices. If you look at the 2 books that were ordered by the 2 Brummies recently who were convicted, they were Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. Quite clearly, these young men are not religiously literate.
So why are they doing it then?
Well, first of all, I think Shiraz pointed out quite rightly that the Syrian conflict cannot be underestimated in terms of the motivation here. There are a lot of young people who feel extremely frustrated by the Syrian conflict, by the hundreds and thousands of people who are being killed there, and the impotence that many people feel. If you combine that with a situation in which a number of young people in this country feel politically disenfranchised, marginalised, let's look at the profile of some of these young men. They're coming from Portsmouth, they're coming from Cardiff, they're coming from Aberdeen. They're not investment bankers from Chelsea, let's face it. These are guys who are either unemployed or working in
But you're saying that poverty is drawing them to this message?
I think poverty and alienation absolutely provide the structural factors which draw people to messages, radical messages.
I'd just like to say I actually agree with you on most things. As
Fantastic.
You know. Yes, most things, not everything. But it is to do with Islam in a sense, because Islam was founded by the sword, let's face it. It really was.
It's not to do with Islam.
What I'm saying is it's attracting
come on.
people who want excitement and doing something.
Let's have a bit of clarity. This is not a British problem, and it's not an Islamic problem either.
So the way this is set up, and I'll be providing links to all of the things, with exception of the Bertrand Russell, which was hard to, and the Christopher Hitchens quote. I just grabbed them off the internet, and they're both dead. So for better or worse, I'll be providing links to these other things. You have this panel on the BBC, one side sits on the left, the other on the right, and they don't agree. You just heard the obscurantist side of things. None of this has anything to do with Islam. Of course, these gentlemen who, this was actually prior to the attacks, people who participate in these things, they're driven by poverty and infrastructure issues and what have you. And towards the end, another guy says has nothing to do with Islam. I mean, even going even further. Well, here's the problem, and this is in the case of the smaller elephant in the room, Islam. There is an issue with Islam, and some of what I have to say is going to be similar or mirror what Sam Harris has to say, but I just largely agree with him on this. That's the only reason. And forgive me for using the word problematic, but at this current juncture in time, the religion of Islam presents is uniquely problematic compared to others. One thing that Sam Harris talks about, and I think is very relevant, is the power of beliefs, which is to say people are motivated by what they believe. If you don't believe something, you tend not to do it, right? Now, this should be childishly easy to understand. If you don't believe something, you don't do it. If you don't believe in a war, you're probably not going to fight in it unless they absolutely conscript you. So even if there was some context, and I do think there's a context, a socioeconomic context for disenfranchisement and discontent, you still need to believe certain things to be motivated and do things. After all, there are plenty of young men who are equally disenfranchised and equally discontent, and tragically they end up killing themselves instead of joining a glorious death cult, which I think we can safely call ISIS. And the counter side, the journalist, the woman says, well, Islam was founded by the sword, and let's face it, there are heaps of evidence supporting the idea that Islam was not a founded by a hippie. Muhammad was a conqueror, and that is an image that has stuck with the religion of Islam for a long time. Now, I'm not saying that all Muslims are like that, and there are 1.5 or what have you billion Muslims in the world, and I'm not talking about the theological existential details here. I'm an atheist. I don't think there's any evidence for any of this being true, but merely that most Muslims are peaceful. But let's think about the numbers here. That even if we have 1.5 billion, even if it's a tiny fraction, 3 or 4% of Muslims believe this, of 1.5 billion, we're still talking about millions of Muslims who believe in so-called extreme ideas. Now, this side, the right side on the panel, was very, very insistent that this has nothing to do with Islam. Let's get a listen to someone named Maajid Nawaz, who is a reformer. He recently penned a book, a dialogue between himself and Sam Harris, basically trying to work out the kinks on how to reform Islam. And I don't agree with him on everything, but he's at least intellectually honest that there is a unique problem at this stage of the game with the religion of Islam that needs to be addressed. And frankly speaking, it needs to be most addressed by practitioners of the religion. So let's have a listen, and I'll be posting a link to this as well.
I want to finish this point by saying one thing. A lot of people say terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. And this is where I agree with Ali. It's incorrect to say terrorist violence perpetrated by Muslims has nothing to do with Islam. Of course, they are citing plausible readings of scripture. It's also as incorrect to say it has everything to do with Islam. That's the other end of the extreme. I think a frank and honest approach to this would be to say that it has something to do with Islam. Not everything, but something. And not nothing, but something. And that something is the fact that these jihadist terrorists do resort to a plausible reading of scripture. And the counter-narrative to that plausible reading isn't as strong as theirs. And part of the solution, yes, foreign policy is part of the solution. Yes, identity crises are part of the solution that need to be addressed. Also part of the solution is ideology and challenging their interpretation.
And I think he's spot on here. Like I said, I don't agree 100% with him. I'd say 80 to 90% on the thing, not just specifically this clip, but things he says. If moderate Muslims are engaged in obfuscation and are unwilling to even recognize and acknowledge violent passages in the Quran and violent passages in the Hadith, they are essentially in lockstep. They're never going to be able to challenge the very plausible reading, as Maajid Nawaz says, of Islamist jihadists. The unique problem with Islam this time is that for all their peaceful ways, moderate Muslims don't want to openly talk about these things and simply say, look, there are violent passages in the Quran, and we need to talk about them. We need to reinterpret them. We can't just pretend they don't exist, because, once again, belief motivates behavior. If these passages exist, jihadists can cite them, they can use them for inspiration, and so on and so forth. If you claim that this has nothing to do with Islam, as the panel literally says, this has nothing to do with Islam, we are going to be left in this quagmire for the foreseeable future. And most of the time, when you speak to moderate Muslims, the type that don't go out blowing people up and shooting people and killing apostates and doing some, have you seen, I don't know if you've seen some of the quote-unquote glorious acts of ISIS. These guys are a death cult. I've seen videos and pictures of them taking, say, a Yazidi woman, slitting her throat while still breathing and bleeding her into a bowl, right? I've seen decapitated children, kids 3 or 4 years old, decapitated because they were Christian or whatever. So to say, and a lot of this is based on references in the Hadith and in the Quran on how to deal with non-Muslims. If you engage in this game of obfuscation, you can never address the problem. If you pretend it doesn't exist, you can never address the problem. And this, unfortunately, is what the majority of moderate Muslims are doing. They're not willing. Maajid Nawaz is an exception. And I think he's heroic in his efforts. He was also, you can hear his biography in the video I linked, a political prisoner in Egypt. He used to be a extremist and Islamist. He reformed himself. Very interesting story. You can check it out. But I've never claimed it has everything to do with Islam. Of course, as I said, you need to have a context. Foreign policy contributes to the context, lack of economic opportunities, but you need to have a belief system that's going to catapult you to do these sorts of things, and you need to have a source of that belief. We can find that source, unfortunately, in the Quran. Yes, there are pretty passages in the Quran. There are pretty passages in the Bible and bad passages as well. And if we were living in, say, 14th or 15th century Europe, I would say that Christianity is uniquely problematic at this era, at this age, at this juncture in time. We're not living in 14th century or 15th century Europe. We're living in the 21st century in Europe. And I think it's safe to say that Christianity is not a huge problem right now compared to certain elements of Islam. And people's unwillingness, above all, Muslim unwillingness to address these issues, is going to end in calamity. They wish to put their heads in the sand and ignore this as if it is not a problem and is completely unrelated to Islam, because they get on fine by ignoring these violent passages. Hell, they probably don't even read them. They just go about their business and live a good life, whatever. So of course the majority of Muslims don't do these sorts of things. But given 1.5 billion people, even a few percentage points of that means millions of Muslims. Even 1% means millions of Muslims. And on my observation, a majority of Muslims do engage in this tactic of obfuscation and an unwillingness to address this element of the religion of Islam. Now, as to get to the actual motivations of the jihadists, well, Ernest Becker talked about this in The Denial of Death, not about jihadists per se, but the Immortality project, as he referred to it, the desire to transcend oneself. Mortality salience creates a vacuum to be filled in most people. Some people fill it through different, completely peaceful means. They try to create meaning in their lives, and I think you could argue that most religious Muslims do that. Most religious Muslims are moderate. They're not going to, they ignore the violent passages, and so they just go about their business. They have their communities. Religion, of course, creates artificial meaning in a universe that is otherwise without any objective meaning. But some people take it to the next level because of whatever reason, unique psychology and so on and so forth. Back in the day, we hear stories, say in the tale of the Iliad or Gilgamesh, of heroic efforts of men to engage in great deeds, be them war or something else, the task of Hercules, all of these things. These are collectively referred to as immortality projects, deeds that outlast the doer, deeds that transcend the mortality of the doer, that leave some kind of legacy. And tons of people are interested in legacy. I'm not, because I think it's absolutely senseless and futile. But frankly speaking, I'm a hardened rationalist. I know whatever legacy I might have is absolutely minuscule and inconsequential in terms of the universe and the world at large. But that doesn't stop most people engaging in legacy projects, immortality projects. So essentially, when we look at the really extreme end of the religion of Islam, and it is related, it has something, not everything, but something to do with Islam. In the case of Islamism and jihadism, they're engaged in an immortality project, in something greater than themselves, something that will essentially lend immortality to them, a project of legacy. Now, because of the unique context of the Quran, they can make use of certain passages to not justify, but to inform what they're doing. They don't need justification. They can simply say, it says it here, therefore I do it. Now, of course, it's a matter of interpretation, but it is a plausible interpretation, unfortunately, to behead apostates, even if they're young children, to cut the throats of people, naked people, and bleed them into a bowl. To say that has nothing to do with Islam when it is a plausible interpretation of a very extreme one, mind you, is problematic. And I'm sure Sargon of Akkad doesn't like me using that word, but it's very appropriate here. The Immortality Project is probably the ultimate form, the highest achievement of the contented irrationalist. Not the peaceful religious person engaged in community projects so as to rid himself or herself of that aspect of mortality salience, to give him or herself meaning in an empty, voided universe. No. This is the ultimate sense of contented irrationalists, because these guys think they're doing the absolute best thing possible. They're engaged in a project of immortality, paradise. This is way, way, way offhand. But until we can talk about the source of their motivations, the source of human motivation to obfuscate certain unpleasant truths about ourselves and the world we live in, we are going to be forever lost. And I think, frankly speaking, we will be. As the late great Hitchens said, religion is ineradicable, so is, unfortunately, irrationality. It's something that the other late great man, Bertrand Russell, perhaps didn't get, at least in the interview that he had at the time, which I believe was produced in the 60s by the BBC, that most people are going to stay irrational because in terms of evolutionary cost-benefit, it's more beneficial to be rational, rather irrational. It's more beneficial to be irrational because that's going to keep you going. That's going to push your desire to survive and pass on your genes. If you believe your erroneous beliefs are true, or the erroneous quality of your beliefs, more importantly, those aspects are irrelevant, and you can keep on chugging along to survive long enough to pass on your genes, that's a really useful evolutionary tool. And so I see no reason why that should disappear anytime soon, and it tells us something rather depressing, more confrontation with reality. The Immortality project of the awareness of mortality, mortality salience, the things that people do, well, the converse of that is the Rationality project, and I think it's ultimately one doomed to failure. I might be well known as a content producer for not being overly optimistic. It's not because I'm just naturally a pessimist. I just see things for as they are. When I look at the world, when I see the way people behave, and not just in religious terms, but we see the obfuscatory tactics of SJWs and what have you, it seems clear to me that most people are not particularly interested in being rational. It might be that if we were all rational, we could improve the world, because then we could deal with the reality as it is rather than dancing around certain things. But that isn't the case. Most people are engaged in the project of the contented irrationalist. And as far as rationality is concerned, that isn't going to be coming anytime soon to our species. But on a final note, with regards to this smaller elephant in the room, of the bigger part of the conflict between ego and reality and truth, which is the actual elephant in the room, Muslims need, as collectively, yes, Muslims need to start addressing these particularly problematic aspects of Islam, instead of wholesale, whole cloth denying that it has just nothing to do with Islam. It's simply not true. Yes, there's a context. Yes, there are economic issues. Yes, there's foreign policy. But because of the unique content of the Quran and the Hadith, it gives a context beyond the political context and serves as fuel for radicalization and what we view as batshit crazy ideas. To them, it's not batshit crazy. This is all quite true and quite plausible. Once again, their interpretations are a plausible interpretation of what's going on. And until Muslims, specifically Muslims, because they're the ones who need to reform their faith, it's not secular atheists like myself who think the whole thing is a bunch of bunk anyway. They need to address this openly and talk about these passages openly. And if they don't do this, we're going to be dealing with this for years to come. As Sam Harris put it, this is getting really boring, right? Every couple of months or years, there's some new attack in some European city. We're going to see more probably, and when it happens, the same kind of obfuscatory, obscurantist rhetoric is going to be brought to the table. Oh, it has to do with poverty. Let me say once again, many of the people who join these causes are highly educated, doctors, engineers, they have university education. This isn't just about poverty or socioeconomic disenfranchisement. I mean, this is the rhetoric that we hear all the time. But let's be honest, it's just bunk when we know that the profiles of a lot of these people participating in this Islamicism are profiles of education, of being middle class, and so on and so forth. They're engaged in their own immortality project. We need to start talking about ourselves as evolved animals that do really stupid things. In the plainest language, we are evolved animals that do really stupid things still. Despite our intelligence, despite this or that, we are just animals. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to talk about ourselves in the context of evolution and modernity and how that interacts. Whatever it might be, men, women, religion, whatever. Everyone, thanks for watching, and I will check you out at a later date. Take care. Bye-bye.